Hi everyone, welcome to the November 28th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski as we look back at this past weekend in racing, the holiday week. I hope everybody out there had a nice Thanksgiving last Thursday, and there was some nice racing both on Thanksgiving Day and the weekend after that. That's typically the case. They run the Clark, some stakes out at Del Mar. We'll talk about all of those, a few from Aqueduct. And Craig, I think a theme throughout this podcast is something we were talking about the last couple of weeks. These few weeks after the Breeders' Cup, we start to see some new 2-year-old faces emerge, some horses that are running speed figures that are quite comparable to those that we saw in the major 2-year-old races before that. So we're going to have a lot of 2-year-old performances to discuss on this podcast.
Yeah, and it's Churchill Downs runs it was one of their future stars days this weekend. Always the bane of my existence, trying to make speed figures for a full card of 2-year-olds, but this one didn't seem too tough, and there were some really good performances, as you noted, at both Churchill, Aqueduct, and Del Mar as well.
Yeah, that's the order that we'll go in on this podcast, beginning with Churchill Downs. And the major race that they ran there last Friday was the Grade 2 Clark. This one going the 1.8 mile distance for the older horses. And a bit of an upset here as Trademark got the job done. And maybe 13-1 was a bit of an overlay on this horse. Craig is saying that is a little bit of a red board, but this is a horse that we've talked about for months now. He's been running competitive speed figures really all year long, had been coming off a disappointing performance in the Fayette Stakes in his prior effort, but the bettors really abandoned him here, and he just got back to his better races, which was good enough to win here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could see the odds. He was kind of a no excuse way back. He didn't have the easiest trip wide around the track last time in the Fayette, but for whatever reason, a horse who has basically always shown up all year didn't show up last time, and the price got a little bit out of hand. He was able to run back to the speed figures we've seen from him in the past, hitting the 120 mark, and it was good enough narrowly to get the job done over First Mission. I would probably argue First Mission maybe ran a little bit better race to narrowly miss. I mean, it was a really tight photo finish. He was the one up there pressing a fast piece set by Film Star, a horse we've talked about a few times recently on our various podcasts. So good effort from both of the top two, and not a whole lot of running in behind as they were well clear of the rest of the field.
Yeah, these two really did draw clear of the field. And I guess I see what you're saying. The pace of this race, it's not quite fast enough to be color-coded red. None of the fractions are, I should say. But it was an honest pace. We saw them running a 140-plus TimeformUS pace figure for that opening quarter mile. And First Mission was chasing, did make the first move to take over. Trademark, though, was always traveling well in behind horses. And once he peeled out at the top of the stretch, you could see that he was going goodbye. There was some anxious moments in the final 16th. It did appear that First Mission came out dramatically to sort of meet Trademark in the middle of the track, and there was some bumps exchanged, but it seemed like it was pretty much equal sides. They both were pushing a little bit, so understand the steward's not really taking a look at this one, and Trademark was just able to get his nose down on the wire first. Solid performance from the third place finisher, Il Miracolo. He's a horse who has just been picking up checks in some major races throughout the season. A slight speed figure regression for him, but another good performance.
Yeah, it was solid. He's a horse who just seems a little bit of a cut below. I think his one win recently was in the Smarty Jones, which are prep for the Pennsylvania Derby. But in a division that's going to be lacking horses next year, I like the fact that he shows up, he runs a lot, and runs well every time.
We should mention, Craig, there was another dirt race going the same 1.8 mile distance run earlier in the day at Churchill Downs. I believe it was the 6th race of the day, an allowance race, which did achieve a final time that was actually faster than that of the Clark. I know that's a difficult situation for a speed figure maker because you expect the Clark horses to run so much faster than what was just a first level allowance race. The winner of that race, Grand Aspen, I think you did give a pretty big speed figure to. Hard to know what to make of it, though, because he was beating a field of primarily horses that looked turf meant or just those that hadn't really run that fast yet.
Yeah, it's a race I'm going to review today. Luckily, I finished all of my work. I had basically have nothing on my plate, and I'm honestly not very happy with that speed figure. I know you're a little skeptical of it, or probably a lot skeptical, and I would say you should be. I did go back and time it last night to make sure the times were correct, and the best I can tell, they are. The one difference that I would note is even though the run up is listed as 50 feet for both, and who knows if it's really 50 feet or not, race six was noticeably longer. I don't know how much that would affect the figure, but it's one where I really have to go back and look because all of the sprints, which were on both sides of these two route races, I think there was even a third route race, were really consistent throughout the card, which is why I initially went with just using the same variant. But as I sit here and look at the chart, it's just one that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'm going to give it a good look over today on Tuesday as we record. So by the time you hear this, it's possible that figure will be different.
Yeah, and tough situation. I mean, the Churchill main track has been playing interestingly. So it feels like it's been changing throughout the day on a few occasions. We'll talk about that as we get to some later races, especially on Saturday's card. But especially with them taking some races off the turf recently, and actually that sixth race was a race that came off the turf. I totally get it that a lot of those horses might not, you wouldn't expect them, let's say, to achieve their top turf speed figures running on a surface that they don't prefer. Let's move on to the feature race from that Thanksgiving Thursday card at Churchill, the Grade 3 Falls City. And don't often see 1-9 these days, Craig, but I kind of get it. The bettor's making Kijera that kind of favorite, and she certainly delivered on that kind of backing, winning this race fairly easily. There just wasn't a whole lot of competition for her, and she did what she was supposed to do.
She did, and I thought she ran fine. It was a race that didn't feature very much pace. The half mile was double digits, wasn't able to hit the 100 mark. I did like that she was able to sit off of that slow pace comfortably and finish the race pretty strong. As you said, I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of competition in here. She paid 230 to win. I guess the breakage Kentucky rules helped out the heavy chalk players in this one, but it's a race where I just am not going to put a whole lot of stock in it. It's a race we gave the pace upgrade to. The final time figure, she only ran a 109. It was upgraded to a 116. But when you look at the rest of the chart, it's pretty easy to see why. The horses in behind her, if we rated Kijera on basically how she's been running of late, all the other horses would be much too high, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's kind of a similar situation, actually, a very similar situation to what happened on Friday with the Clark, where there was an allowance race earlier in the day. I think it was race 6 on Thursday that was going the same mile and an eighth distance, and it actually went faster than the Falls City did. The winner of that race, Musical Mischief, a horse who had never run anything close to the kind of speed figures that Kijera usually runs, and really nobody in that sixth race field had. So kind of strains credulity that that race could get a faster speed figure. I'm sure that some speed figure makers did give it a higher number, but kind of a tough situation. I get it. Breaking out that Falls City with the P upgrade, that notation will show up in the TimeformUS PPs when Kijera runs back. So it makes sense for her. The rest of the field, they obviously were not at her level. They're going to get a number that's maybe a little bit inflated, but not by too much, maybe a few points for when they run back. But that notation will be in the TimeformUS past performances. You know, Craig, I saw some people after the race speculating that Kijera might be the best fillier mare on the dirt out there. I guess we'll see who stays in training next year. Some of these 3-year-olds turning 4. She has to prove herself against some tougher competition because she hasn't necessarily beaten the best 3-year-old fillies in the division. I mean, we saw some of them in the Breeders' Cup Distaff. I think you still have to consider Randomized the most exciting horse going into her 4-year-old season if they do keep her in training. Pretty Mischievous, obviously, accomplished a lot more. So not really viewing her as a contender for the Eclipse Awards, but she definitely is one that the connections can look forward to next year.
Oh, for sure. She was one I wanted to see running the Breeders' Cup Distaff after her win. I forget, it was an overnight stake at Churchill when she ran a huge figure, but that doesn't mean I think she would have beat those horses. There's some pretty good fillies and mares out there. So when she steps up in class, she's going to have her work cut out for her.
Now we've got to talk about the other graded stakes that they ran at Churchill on Thursday, and I think this was one of the only turf races they ran this week, maybe the only one, and I think the last turf race of the entire season at Churchill Downs, given the continued problems they've had with the turf course in Louisville, Kentucky. But the winner of this race, Star Fortress, she really liked the going that she encountered at Churchill on Thanksgiving. I mean, she just mowed down this field in the stretch, winning off by 10 lengths, a margin that you rarely see on the turf, especially in graded stakes races. I'm not really sure what to make of this, Craig. It wasn't the strongest grade 3 going into the race. The other horses kind of ran in line with their prior numbers, except for the winner. Hard to really know how good she is because it's not like her European form pointed her out as being some potential superstar, but she really delivered on Thursday.
Yeah, she did for sure. She was a horse who I remember was entered at Keeneland and was scratched. And I was a little interested in her in that day, but I wasn't really betting on Thanksgiving Day. So I didn't see this race at the time. Went and watched the replays that night. And wow, what a performance that was from her. I wound up giving her a 126 TimeformUS speed figure. And basically, it's just based on all the other horses in behind her. The next four kind of just ran the same figures they've always been running. There wasn't a whole lot to go on. As you said, there were very few turf races run at Churchill. This was the only one on the day. So that's really all I had to go on. But when a turf horse wins by 10 lengths, particularly coming from the back of the pack, I wouldn't be surprised at all if she's able to validate that number going forward.
Yeah, I mean, she's a horse who was eligible for a first level allowance coming into this race. She had just achieved a maiden victory all the way back in 2022 in England, and that was actually on an all weather surface. So this was her first ever victory on the turf. Obviously, a big step forward for her. The pace of this race, it worked in her favor. All the fractions are color coded in red. It wasn't a traditional fast-paced race, Craig, in that it didn't necessarily look like they were going that fast, but it just felt like a demanding surface. The course was officially rated good. It's a 5 track condition rating in the TimeformUS PP, so kind of right on that good to yielding borderline. And it just felt like a surface that a lot of horses in the race weren't handling. So this is a number that I'm personally going to be a little skeptical of moving forward because, number one, there's nothing to compare it to, it being the only turf race of the day and really kind of in isolation of this Churchill Downs meet with them running so few races on the turf. And just visually watching the race, you could see halfway through. I mean, the number one, Joyful Applause, wasn't handling the turf at all. I mean, some others came off the bridle earlier than you would expect. It was just a real grind to the finish, and it looked like the only horse that was running through the wire was the winner. So did they all run to their usual figs? I don't know. Maybe they all regressed by 10 points, and that's why the winner was so impressive. To me, it's tough to have a lot of faith in this number, but I'll be very intrigued to see what Star Fortress can do when she runs back.
Yeah, it's an interesting call. I mean, there's really not a whole lot to go on, so I just go with the law of averages that not all the horses are going to regress by a bunch, but it's certainly possible. I forget the horse's name. I remember we saw the Chad Brown filly run that huge figure under similar circumstances, and I don't believe she's won in several starts since.
Yeah, same thing. Speak of the devil. That was when obviously they were having a lot of issues with the Churchill Downs course when it was, I think, first installed. And clearly those issues have persisted with them barely using the course at all. And it's just been one of those courses that some horses seem to love, some don't get over it. I think as a handicapping angle, it's been just wise to be a little forgiving of some horses that don't run well in some select races at Churchill Downs on the turf. So just something to follow moving forward. And now let's move on to that Future Stars Friday that we were talking about towards the top of the show or I should say future, whatever they call it, the Stars of the Future Saturday. I don't know. Maybe you know, Craig. I think I'm conflating the Breeders' Cup with this Saturday card at Churchill Downs. But they ran the 2 graded stakes for the 2-year-olds, the Kentucky Jockey Club and the Goldenrod, both grade 2 events. Both of them were won from off the pace. Craig will tackle the Kentucky Jockey Club first, where Honor Marie swooped from last to get up to win this race, going away at the end. And it's not like this was a race that featured a ton of pace. The horse actually was able to make a couple moves to catch up to the field early and then make that sweeping move around the far turn to take over on the stretch. This is definitely a horse that improved with added distance, sort of a modestly bred son of Honor Code, only cost $40,000. First graded stakes win for the trainer. Just exciting all around.
Yeah, it was a really nice effort from him, I thought. I call this pain in the butt Saturday when they do this, as I kind of hinted at in the beginning, but it wasn't too bad in this case. And I really liked what I saw from Honor Marie. He was actually a horse who caught my eye last time when he ran second. I was pretty impressed with how he finished up in the slop in a race that didn't feature any pace. So I wasn't all that surprised that he took a nice step forward all the way up to a 107 TimeformUS speed figure. So good effort by him. It's none. You mentioned we'll see some 2-year-olds running figures similar to the Breeders' Cup. This wasn't one of them. He's still got some work to do, but he certainly appreciated the extra ground. And this was also a race where the pace was, I would just say, at most average, maybe a little bit on the slow side. I think we have one of the fractions coated in blue, and to finish it off the way he did was really impressive.
Yeah, I mean, when you were handicapping these races going in, they definitely did not seem like the strongest editions of the Kentucky Jockey Club or the Goldenrod that we've ever encountered. But there was potential in here, and we saw, obviously, improvement from the winner of this race, who really did seem to take a step forward with the added distance. I mean, Craig, I look at this pedigree, and I'm kind of wondering how this horse sold for only $40,000. I mean, I know Honor Code has sort of gone out of fashion as a sire. I mean, he had some initial success, but I know that in the breeding world, they're always kind of captivated by the hottest new thing that goes to stud, and Honor Code's kind of forgotten at this point. But on the dam side, this horse has so much stamina in the pedigree. The dam is actually a half sister to a St. Leger winner in England who won that Group 1 race going around 1.75 miles. So, I mean, there's real stamina for Honor Marie to keep getting better with added distance, and definitely appreciated the 2 turns here. As for some others in behind, I thought Real Men Violin ran fine, kind of encountered a little bit of traffic coming to the quarter pole and came through willingly along the inside, just second best. That was a horse who already had plenty of route experience. The one that I think people will focus on coming out of this race, Craig, that had some trouble is Risk It, who really caused his own chaos by just getting so unsettled in the middle half of the race, was really rank moving down the backstretch, just refusing to settle under Tyler Gaffalione. And surprising that he actually finished fourth, beating over half the field, given how much he was fighting the rider in the early stages. But a horse that's going to have to get over that if he has future success going longer.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, he's a horse who had went 1 turn mile at Churchill last time and ran okay, but that's not a good sign for me if a horse is fighting the rider. But he is just a 2-year-old, so maybe Steve Asmussen can work it out.
The Goldenrod, the 2-year-old filly counterpart to the Kentucky Jockey Club, really resulted in a pretty decisive winner, as Intricate, 6-1 shot, just got a great trip, saving ground in the pocket most of the way, letting a runoff speed go in the early stages. That horse was kind of running in her own little race. And when that one came back, Intricate just came through between horses, took over, and pulled clear pretty impressively from the odds-on favorite Torpedo Anna, who couldn't really offer that same strong finish that we had seen from her around 1 turn, going a little longer in this race. But Intricate certainly relished the added distance.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this was a good effort. I'm not sure where it came from based on speed figures, but again, these are 2-year-olds. She had shown she could handle the 1/16 at Keeneland, albeit in a much slower race and a much slower time. But, if you're really going to notice these horses improve as they stretch out when they're maturing, is what I found. Usually they're a little faster sprinting and it takes time to catch up. So not always going to be that surprised when horses take big leaps up like this one did. And just another to keep your eye on, because she's another. I really liked how she finished off the race. She was able to stay within contact of a solid pace and just blew the rest of the field away.
Yeah, I'm not going to be too hard on the runner-up Torpedo Anna. I was actually a little surprised, or I should say, I would have been surprised that Connections would run back in this race so quickly, but it's Ken McPeak, and he just loves to run his horses, which we appreciate, but she was coming back in just 15 days off a big effort, so perhaps, she just couldn't... I don't want to use the word bounce, but maybe she was just a little over the top for this performance. We'll probably see her in some other stakes moving down the line. But the winner definitely took a big step forward. And like you say, we can see those sudden improvements from these 2-year-olds at this point in the season. Should mention, Craig, just kind of comparing some of the 2-year-olds that we did see in the Breeders' Cup to these horses. This race got a very comparable speed figure to the Juvenile Fillies that was won by Just FYI, and there was a common participant between those two races as Central Avenue, who was actually second at Just FYI in the Frisette, finished third here, beaten by a similar margin, just over 5 lengths. So not going to be surprised if the best horses didn't necessarily compete in the Breeders' Cup, and I think that's something that we've grown accustomed to seeing in the past few years.
Yeah, there was a noticeable difference in speed figures between the Breeders' Cup Juvenile and Juvenile Fillies, obviously, as fierceness ran off, and it maybe made the Juvenile Fillies look not quite as good as they are, but they also didn't run much of a speed figure, and it remains to be seen. It seems like this division probably has some others who will be up and coming.
Significant upset in the race just prior to those 2 graded stakes at Churchill on Saturday. The Ed Brown listed stakes going 6.5 furlongs for the 2-year-old males. Booth had generated so much buzz coming out of his debut race, and I think was the 2-year-old that most racing fans were most excited to see on this Saturday card at Churchill Downs. But he was a big disappointment in this race and set it up for quite an upset here, as Just Steel was able to win this at 12-1 as one of the most experienced members of this field. Typical Dwayne Lucas, just keep running the horses, and some of them thrive on it, some of them don't. Just Steel cutting back to 6.5 furlongs, was able to get back to his better efforts and got the win here, going away at the end over a runner-up, Agu, who going out for the same barn as the winner of the Kentucky Jockey Club, finished a solid second in this race. But I think the real story was just the huge regression from Booth.
Yeah, I do want to say I love seeing horses like Just Steel who run and they're able to handle it. Maybe his form doesn't look all that great, but Wayne Lucas is a guy who doesn't seem to care much about his winning percentage, which I like. And Just Steel was able to get the job done, run a nice speed figure. He got a 104, which was matched basically what he ran at Saratoga, breaking his maiden Booth. I don't really know what happened to him. He just seemed a little flat, never really looked like the same horse in his debut when he had run that big speed figure. And it's not like that speed figure has really had all that many questions, as the field behind him has come back and run very strong. Nash, who was second that day, came back with a big figure. A couple other horses behind have run really nice races with similar speed figures. So it just seems like for whatever reason, Booth didn't show up with his best.
Yeah, I mean, definitely had more competition for the early lead in this race, and just really didn't have the same finish that we saw from him on debut. We'll see if he can bounce back to a better effort, but clearly a horse that showed a lot of talent wasn't able to back it up here. Let's move on to some other 2-year-old performances from that Saturday card at Churchill, some non-stakes events. Early in the day, a maiden race going 7 furlongs was won by the Cherie DeVoe trained Legalize. And Craig, I think this was actually the fastest speed figure that you assigned to any race on this 12-race Saturday card of 2-year-old performances. And I can see why. I mean, they just went fast every step of the way here. Legalize busted out of the gate, established the front end. It was a bit of a merry-go-round affair, nobody doing much closing in the end, but this horse was able to sustain his speed through the wire.
Yeah, big improvement off his first start, ran a 112 Timeform US speed figure. And again, as I mentioned, I just kind of have to trust the clock on days like this because there's not a whole lot to go on. It didn't seem like any big changes in track speed throughout the card. So I trusted what I saw and just assumed this horse improved big time second start out, which wouldn't be a big surprise for us to read DeVoe. It's kind of her MO. If you look at the Timeform US trainer ratings, her first time starter rating is a 68 on that 1 to 100 scale. Her second time out is a 93. So it's obviously what she does. And it's not like Legalized didn't run well first time out. I just think he wasn't fully cranked. He took a lot of money that day. So he had obviously shown some talent in the mornings.
Yeah, I mean, if people notice some differences between your numbers and the buyers for this day, it looks like buyer split this day kind of some basically right in the middle. I think somewhere around race 6, 7, or 8, and I guess had the second half of the day the track getting slower, so you'll notice bigger speed figures for the stakes races. If you're looking at the buyer numbers, they had Legalized, I think, is maybe the fourth or fifth fastest of the day. So I mean, just something to consider, and it's really hard to know what the right thing to do is, Craig. Like you were saying, you have so little to go on these days with the 2-year-olds. It's to be expected that some of them are going to take big steps forward, but who moves forward more than others? It's really hard to know. This race, I mean, just kind of playing it straight, it did come up very fast. I mean, we had seen the third place finisher already run a fast number. I guess the high speed figure is a little bit surprising for the second place finisher, but that's a horse who was making his first start off a trainer switch to Steve Asmussen. So, I mean, it's believable. And like you said, Cherie DeVoe, I mean, not a surprise these days when she has a good horse, because it's become quite apparent in 2023 that she is building up a formidable stable of top older horses, top young horses, and I think we're going to hear a lot from her in some stakes events in a lot of divisions next year. Let's talk about one more non-stakes event from this Churchill Saturday card. That was an allowance race that went as race 4, and 2-year-old filly maintaining an undefeated record here in just 2 career starts. That's Denim and Pearls for the Brad Cox barn. And I thought this was a visually impressive performance. She made a decisive move to take over just before the quarter pole and really sustained that finish through the stretch here to win off by over 3 lengths in the end. Not sure what was behind her this day, but she seems like one that is going to have a stay in stakes company fairly soon.
Yeah, she ran a 105 Timeform US speed figure, so better than the stakes race later on the card, and looked good doing it. This is a day where you usually expect to hear the Brad Cox name mentioned more prominently, particularly in the stakes races, but turns out maybe this was the best horse he sent out on the day. She's 2 for 2 now and handled the stretch out to a 1-turn mile nicely and took a nice step forward. So seems like she could go even further if needed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. She was definitely impressive. She's a half sister to Newgate, who Bob Baffert horse who won a grade 3, or I think the Robert B. Lewis a couple seasons ago. So, I mean, there's definitely pedigree here, and she's one that's supposed to get better with some added distance. So, definitely another exciting runner that we saw win on that Saturday card at Churchill Downs. Let's move on to New York, and not quite as many races to discuss. The major race that they ran last Saturday was the Grade 3 Cumley, and I guess you could compare this race to the one that Kijera ran at Churchill Downs, Craig, because that race came up maybe a little bit slower than some were expecting. I know we gave her the upgraded speed figure, but I mean, I'm not sure it's clear that she's so much better than the horses that we saw in the Cumley. Raging Sea, a horse that has taken a little while to come around during her 3-year-old season. She had obviously shown talent as a 2-year-old, being thrust right into Grade 1 company in the second and third starts of her career, but kind of the rare Chad Brown horse that wasn't quite ready off the layoff when she first came back, but she's just been improving with every appearance during her 3-year-old campaign. And I think we saw the best yet on Saturday.
Yeah, really nice. And you mentioned Chad Brown. That's something to keep an eye on. I've noticed a few of his horses of late haven't really been coming back ready to roll. Not saying he did a bad training job by any stretch. Just seems like maybe his MO's changed a little bit with at least some horses who have been running better second and third time out. And Raging Sea certainly did that. Got a nice 115 Timeform US speed figure. And I hate to say it, but I was actually impressed with Julia Shining too, who I guess she's found some life. I thought she ran better than it looked last time out, but she's a horse who is a kind of one. Everybody knows her name from her 2-year-old season when she won the Demoiselle, and it's good to see her back in form because I think her last two were pretty good after she ran some not so good races.
Yeah, it feels like these two daughters of Curlin are really coming into their own towards the end of their 3-year-old seasons. Prior to this race, it seemed like maybe Julia Shining would be the kind of horse that they might whisk off to the breeding shed, but it feels like she is coming around, and I hope they do keep her in training as a 4-year-old. I mean, there's no reason not to, just given her bloodlines and the way that she's supposed to improve over time. And I agree. I didn't think that she necessarily hung at the end of this race. I mean, it looked in mid-stretch like she was going to blow by Raging Sea, but it did feel like Raging Sea dug in and wanted it a little bit more. We saw a similar trait from her when she broke her maiden on debut as a 2-year-old. So she's definitely a fighter, and she was just able to fend off Julia Shining at the end. And even when you watch the gallop out, Julia Shining never goes by Raging Sea, but they both got solid 1:15 TimeformUS speed figures, legitimately earned. No pace upgrades or TimeformUS question mark notations about this fake. This was just a pretty strong race overall. So definitely feels like a couple of horses that could take that next step forward if they stay in training as 4-year-olds. Then the other race that we'll discuss from Aqueduct last week was a 1-mile 2-year-old maiden special weight event on Friday's card that was won by first-time starter Otello going out for the Christophe Clement barn. And Craig, we've talked about a lot of maiden breakers recently, but I've got to say I really liked what I saw from this 2-year-old. Even though he only won by about a neck, he did a lot of likable things in this race. I mean, broke well, ran so professionally throughout, traveling in the pocket, encountered some traffic trouble that really wasn't his fault at the top of the stretch, but, showed poise to wait and come on through and did it all in a pretty fast race.
Yeah, you kind of covered what I was going to say. He didn't look like a 2-year-old. He looked like a horse who had raced many times and was comfortable in behind horses and was able to come through where a lot of 2-year-olds maybe would be a little reluctant to do so. Ran a really nice 106 TimeformUS speed figure. This was the 1-turn mile at Aqueduct, and I would say with his breeding, he's a horse who should appreciate the extra distance.
Yeah, I mean, the natural comparison is that Chad Brown horse, Sierra Leone, who I think cost over $2 million and was similarly visually impressive, winning on debut a few weeks ago. I think that was on the same day they ran one of the Breeders' Cup cards. That horse we might see in the Remsen. Obviously, we're not going to see Otello in the Remsen coming back in just a week. But I mean, the difference between those two is this race actually came up pretty fast. And I mean, the runner-up and the third-place finisher had already run. So, to be expected that they would take a step forward, both for barns that typically improve horses after they have a start. And I think they did move forward here, but the winner was just a little bit too good for them. And I'll be interested to see where he goes. You might remember his dam, Isabella Sings, who was a really fun horse to watch. She was a turf horse who I believe raced for Todd Pletcher, who would just kind of run off in the early stages of her races. I think she was I want to say it was the Hillsborough at Tampa that one year where Tepin was the winner. But I mean, she opened up like 20 lengths in the early stages and had to come get her. She was a fun horse to watch.
Yeah, I do remember that horse. She was, I'm a sucker for those horses that run off like that as a guy that makes pace figures. So, yes, I definitely remember her.
Let's finish up this podcast by discussing some races from California and Del Mar last week. A trio of graded stakes. We'll begin with the Grade 2 Hollywood Turf Cup, this one going the 1.5-mile distance. And not the strongest field, especially considering that a Chad Brown horse that had just won a first level allowance condition was made the favorite in this race. But I think that's just the respect that's afforded to Chad Brown when he ships out west. I mean, he's had so much success cleaning up in races out there that I think the bettors maybe went a little overboard on that horse. And it created some value elsewhere, especially with a horse like Planetario, Craig, who had been solid, maybe hadn't been able to achieve a grade 1 success when he shipped to the East Coast, but had run well in California previously and just got a really good trip here from Hector Berrios.
Yeah, it was a race with plenty of pace. The leader, Balladeer, a horse who we've seen, I think he ran in the Breeders' Cup, right? Led the Breeders' Cup
Yep.
earlier, was up pressing the pace. Always goes out and goes fast, and set it up nicely for horses like Planetario and Francesco Clemente, the Chad Brown horse, who ran pretty well, but wasn't able to quite get it done over Planetario. Yeah, I would say they went a little crazy betting that horse, Francisco Clemente. He didn't really come in with speed figures matching some of the others in here, but he ran fine. This was a grade 2. It's probably more like a grade 3 if we're comparing it to our East Coast horses, but Planetario is a horse who clearly loves the extra distance.
Yeah, and as for Francesco Clemente, he is a horse that just does not get out of the gate. He's now raced in the US 3 times. He's broken very slowly every time, and not just like a stutter step. I mean, he leaves the gate after everybody else and spots them 2 to 3 lengths in the early stages. A little easier to do that in these marathon races where the start's not as critical, but still leaves these horses with a lot of ground to make up. And I mean, he was really running at the end, but I mean, just had to wait longer than the winner to make his move and basically ran out of ground in that short Del Mar turf stretch.
Yeah, and we did have a South American shipper who ran fine too, was also involved in a pretty close 3 horse photo at the end, and Luca for Neil Drysdale. So he's one who could maybe improve second time out, as he had not raced in about 6 months.
Let's discuss another grade 2 event on the turf. This one from, I believe, the Saturday card at Del Mar, won by Easter. That was the Seabiscuit Stakes. And a little bit of an upset here, Craig, as Hong Kong Harry got nailed in the late stages by this runner who was making his first start since a trainer switch away from Graham Motion into the Phil D'Amato barn. And never hurts to go to Phil D'Amato when you're stabled in California as a top turf horse. And I would say Easter basically ran up to the level of what we had seen from him under Graham Motion. Just got a great ride and trip from Antonio Fresu, who saved ground. This is a horse who can get rank, but was able to just keep enough of a lid on him throughout the early stages and kept him covered up, saving ground for as long as he possibly could. And once he peeled out in the stretch, he had that kick to run down the favorite Hong Kong Harry.
Yeah, the old Phil D'Amato 1-2-3 finish in the Seabiscuit. I think the two that finished 1-2 were clearly best. Easter got a great trip, as you said. I think if these horses raced each other 10 times, it would probably be 5-5, just kind of work out on the trip. They both ran good races, about as expected, and I think trips were really the difference.
Yeah, I get that. For Hong Kong Harry, didn't really have an excuse. Maybe he moved a little bit too soon, given the way the race was coming apart at the end. But you could make the argument he was supposed to win this race because he also got a great trip in here. I mean, saving ground in the pocket the entire way. Just it was a race that did kind of go to the closers in the end, and Easter was able to get up on the wire. One more graded stakes to mention from Del Mar. That was their Sunday feature, the grade 3 native diver. This one on the dirt course, going 9 furlongs. And a pair of 3-year-olds dominating this one, as the Bob Baffert trained Mr. Fisk has just kind of been quietly improving this season and able to get a graded stakes victory here. Both of these horses that finished first and second are closing types. I think the difference was Mr. Fisk was able to get the jump on the tough trip Skinner, who just can't seem to catch a break with regard to pace or wide trips. But that's the problem with a horse like Skinner. He's always going to be in that position.
Yeah, it is. And I know this was a race you didn't initially have on our rundown, but it's going to come back pretty quick, I think. A 121 TimeformUS speed figure. And if these two weren't 3-year-olds, it's probably one I wouldn't talk about. But given the division, the way it's looking forward, the way it's looking going forward into 2024, it's really hard to say who are going to be the leaders. So these horses, they ran fine. The only thing I would say about the speed figure is this was the only route on the card. So it wasn't the easiest race to make a speed figure for. So maybe it's one you want to be just a little bit skeptical of.
Yeah, and that's the reason I didn't initially put it on the rundown. If you're comparing it to the sprints, it was a slow race, but I get it. I mean, treating this race separately, being the only route of the day, and also a route race that really didn't feature very much pace. They really back down the pace in the middle portions of this race. And you could see it watching the replay as the entire field just sort of came together like an accordion. That sort of forced Mr. Fisk to make that early move to be 3 wide heading into the far turn. They kind of kicked on again at that point, and Skinner was, left a little behind the 8 ball. These 2 horses, though, Craig, they were really finishing at the end. I mean, I think the final 8th went in just over 12 flat. Looking up those closing fractions and GMAX, I mean, the winner threw in a couple of sub 6-second 16ths towards the end of the race. So, I mean, they were really finishing at the end. So not your typical dirt route where they go fast early and are kind of struggling to the finish. I mean, these 2 seem like they have no problem, producing a finish. So it'd be interesting to see what they could do in a race with a little more pace. So I don't really have a problem with a higher speed figure for the top 2.
Yeah, and that's why I was going to say, now that's not an official speed figure. I won't have that probably till tonight from my assistant, and it's definitely one that's going to be coded in blue with slow fractions. So we generally don't use the P notation if a race is the only one, like the only route on the day or the only turf race, but occasionally we will. So I'm not sure exactly how he's going to do it, but I'm pretty confident that the speed figure will still be in the low 120s, however we decide to get there.
One more race to discuss from Del Mar, also on that Sunday card, a 2-year-old filly maiden special weight event early in the day, won by the debuting Copion for the Richard Mandela barn. I thought this race might come up a little faster, Craig. A horse that was highly touted coming into the race. She was visually impressive. Not sure, though, how good she ultimately is, but she's got some pedigree being a daughter of Omaha Beach.
Yeah, and as you said, this was the same day as the native diver, and the sprints look notably faster. This is just what I'm estimating, so maybe it'll be a little faster. My assistant certainly knows Del Mar a lot better than I do, but so it's kind of a rough estimate. I have it around the 97. I couldn't see it being a whole lot faster. I mean, maybe it could get up to the 100 mark at tops, but she certainly looked good doing it, and it's Richard Mandela, so I would expect some improvement.
Yeah, this filly is a half sister to a number of good runners, including Amiz Gizmo, who was second in the Queen's Plate, and Amiz Flatter, who I think was a graded stakes winner, a stakes placed on turf and dirt. So some really nice horses in this pedigree, and definitely a horse that's bred to go a little bit longer. So we'll see what we get from her when she runs back, perhaps potentially stretching out in her next start. Well, Craig, that wraps up our recap of this holiday weekend of racing around the country. We've got a lot to look forward to on the calendar, at least in the early part of December. Coming up this week at Aqueduct, it's the Cigar Mile, the Remsen, the Demoiselle, that big day. I know the Cigar Mile was downgraded to a grade 2 this year, but I always arguably look more forward to races like the Remsen and the Demoiselle to see those future stars in New York. I think we've got more big racing at Del Mar. I think the Hollywood Derby's coming up, that grade 1 event for the 3-year-olds. So definitely have some things to choose from on the forecast in upcoming weeks.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Gulfstream's kicking off again. They're opening up their turf course. Hopefully that'll last for a while. We'll have some good racing coming up there, particularly as we get into January. But the racing never really stops. Fairgrounds is open. We'll have some big cards coming up for them in December as well. So plenty of good racing coming.
Everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and Craig and I will be back a little bit later in this week with the TimeformUS Forecast.